Today on The Ultimate Sacrifice, I'll be looking at the life of an exceptional woman, Dr. Mary Walker, who helped change the face of medicine during the Civil War and to this very day remains the only woman to have ever been awarded the Medal of Honor. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Louis Marsh, Senior Pastor of River Church, and your host for today's show. Before we jump in, don't forget about my other show as well. It's called Tales from the Script, and it has Bible stories for grown-ups with lots of history and archaeology and information. If you like this show, you're going to love that one. So be sure and check that out. And now let's jump into our story today. Mary Edwards Walker was born in the town of Oswego, New York on November 26th in 1832, the daughter of Alva and Vesta Walker. She was the youngest of 7 children. She had 5 sisters and 1 brother. Alva and Vesta raised both their son and their daughters in what was then called a progressive manner that was pretty revolutionary for that day and age. Their non-traditional parenting nurtured Mary's spirit of independence and sense of justice that she would actively demonstrate throughout her entire life. While they were devoted Christians, the Walkers were what were called, quote, free thinkers, unquote. That was sort of a movement back in those days. And they raised their children as Christians, but also raised them to question the dogmas and the regulations of various denominations that they would come into contact with, not just accept them uncritically. Walker worked on her family farm as a child. Now, she did not wear women's clothing during the farm labor because she considered them too restrictive, so she would, just wear guys' clothes. This, too, will come back into play in her story. She attended the local school that her parents had started. The Walkers were determined that their daughter would be well educated, just as their son. So they founded the first free schoolhouse in Oswego in the late 1830s. After finishing primary school, Mary and 2 of her older sisters attended Falley Seminary in Fulton, New York in her free time. Mary would pore over her father's medical texts on anatomy and physiology. Her interest in medicine was attributable to her exposure to medical literature at an early age. After saving money from teaching school, she attended Syracuse Medical College, where she graduated with honors as a medical doctor in 1855, and as you might expect, yes, she was the only woman in her class. She married a fellow medical student, Albert Miller, on November 16, 1855, shortly before she turned 23. They set up a joint practice in Rome, New York. Now, the practice did not flourish, unfortunately, because female doctors, they just weren't really accepted or trusted or respected at that time. Sometime later, the two would divorce due to him being unfaithful to her. Walker briefly attended Bowen Collegiate Institute in Hopkinton, Iowa in 1860 until she was suspended for refusing to resign from the school's all-male debating team. Inspired by her parents' novel standard of dressing for health purposes, Walker was infamous, or maybe famous, depending on your point of view, I guess, for contesting the traditional female wardrobe. In 1871, she wrote this, quote, "The greatest sorrows from which women suffer today are those physical, moral, and mental ones that are caused by their unhygienic manner of dressing," unquote. By 1861, her typical ensemble included trousers with suspenders under a knee-length dress with a tight waist and a full skirt. Mary volunteered at the outbreak of the Civil War to be a surgeon for the Army, but she was rejected because, you guessed it, she was a woman. She was offered the role of nurse, but she declined that. And instead, she chose to volunteer as a surgeon for the U.S. Army as a civilian. Now, the U.S. Army had no female surgeons, and at first, she was allowed to practice only as a nurse. She served at the First Battle of Bull Run on July 21st, 1861, and at the Patent Office Hospital in Washington, D.C. She worked as an unpaid field surgeon near the Union lines during the Battle of Fredericksburg and also in Chattanooga during the Battle of Chickamauga. In September 1862, Walker wrote the War Department requesting employment as a spy, but her proposal was declined. In September 1863, she employed as a, quote, contract acting assistant surgeon, parentheses, civilian, close parentheses, close quote, by the Army of the Cumberland, becoming the first female surgeon ever employed by the U.S. Army. Walker was later appointed assistant surgeon of the 52nd Ohio Infantry. During her service, she frequently crossed battle lines and treated civilians. On April 10th of 1864, she was captured by Confederate troops and arrested as a spy just after she finished helping a Confederate doctor perform an amputation. She was sent to Castle Thunder in Richmond, Virginia, and remained there in very poor conditions until August 12th of 1864, when she was released as part of a prisoner exchange. Walker was exchanged for a Confederate surgeon from Tennessee. She went on to serve as supervisor of a female prison in Louisville, Kentucky, and as head of an orphanage in Tennessee. After the war was over, Walker was awarded a disability pension for partial muscular atrophy suffered while she was in prison by the enemy. She was given $8.50 a month. Now remember, this is in 1865, so that's worth a lot more than it is now. That payment began on June 13, 1865, but in 1899, she received a raise. The amount was raised to a whopping $20 a month, which back in the day probably wasn't too bad. She attempted to register to vote in 1871, but of course she was turned away. She continued to advocate for women's rights to vote for years thereafter. In 1907, Walker published, quote, Crowning Constitutional Argument, unquote, in which she argued that some states, as well as federal constitution, had already granted women the right to vote. And she testified on women's suffrage before committees of the U.S. House of Representatives in 1912 and later in 1914. After the war, Walker sought a retroactive brevet or commission to validate her service. It was determined that there was no precedent for commissioning a female, but that a, quote, commentary acknowledgement, unquote, could be made in lieu of the commission. So President Johnson personally awarded her the Medal of Honor as an alternative to her rank. In 1916, the U.S. Congress created a pension act for Medal of Honor recipients, and in doing so, created separate Army and Navy medical honor rolls. The Army was directed to review the eligibility of prior recipients, an act that had been requested by the Army itself in order to retroactively police undesirable awards. The undesirable awards resulted from a lack of regulations on the medal back in those days. Now, the Army had published no regulations on this until 1897, and the law had very few requirements, meaning that recipients could earn a medal for virtually any reason, resulting in nearly 900 awards for enlistment extensions, not in combat. Imagine that. You get the Medal of Honor for extending your enlistment. Well, that's crazy. So they wanted to deal with that. So the Army's Medal of Honor Board deliberated from 1916 to 1917, and they struck 911 names from the Army Medal of Honor roll, including Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, our Mary, and William F. Buffalo Bill Cody. Mary, however, refused to return her medal, and she kept it till she died. And you'll see some pictures here of her wearing her medal, which she did regularly throughout her life. After a long illness, Walker died at home on February 21st, 1919, at the age of 86. She was buried at Rural Cemetery in Oswego, New York, in a plain funeral with an American flag draped over her casket and wearing a black suit instead of a dress. Gotta admire that, boy. She was true to her feelings to the end. That is great. I love that. Her death in 1919 came 1 year before the passage of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which guaranteed women the right to vote. So she almost saw it, but not quite. Years later, Jimmy Carter got involved in all this, and many credit President Jimmy Carter with restoring Walker's medal posthumously in 1977. Several articles I read on this do that, but they are incorrect. And the reason they're incorrect is the action that was taken was well below the Secretary of Army, on the level of the Army's Assistant Secretary for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, which was acting on a recommendation from the Board of Correction of Military Records. In fact, both the Ford administration and the Carter administration opposed the restoration of the Medal of Honor to Mary, and the Carter White House reacted with confusion when the board announced that they thought it should be restored, but they didn't have the authority to do it, and so it was never done. So Mary Walker is the first woman to ever receive the Medal of Honor, and the first one, obviously, to ever have it withdrawn as well. Mary Walker felt that she had been awarded the Medal of Honor because she had gone into enemy territory to care for the suffering inhabitants when no man had the courage to do so for fear of being imprisoned. But as of the time of this recording, the decision stands, and she is not a Medal of Honor recipient. And if you go to the official Medal of Honor site, you will not find her there. Now, several books have been written on her life, and I've linked to one down in the comments if you want to check that out. And so that is the amazing story of Mary Walker, the first and, so far, the only woman to ever receive the Medal of Honor. Join me right here throughout December of 2025, if you're watching this live, when I'm going to be sharing stories of actions that took place in and around Christmas that resulted in the Medal of Honor being awarded as well. So till next time, this is Louis. Hold up there, big fella. Hold on there. We are going to stop the presses. Wait. This isn't print. I can't stop the presses, but I can break into my own video. This is slightly later in the evening, Louis, because I forgot something that I wanted to put in here. What you heard was a script I wrote in 2020 with some modifications, but I forgot to put the thing in there the most that I really wanted to discuss. The thing that really kind of ticks me off and makes me angry. And this story is a great example of what we see happening quite often, and it really irritates me when this is done to people from the past who can no longer defend themselves, okay? What am I talking about? I'm talking about me hitting the microphone right there. That's how upset I get. Here's the thing. We know from the story that Mary didn't dress like a woman normally did, that she lived a life very different than most women during her time, you know, going to be a doctor and all the things that she did. She was not your typical woman of her era, for sure. No doubt about that. Here's what happens, though, and I saw this in some of the material I used when I was researching, is that people say, wow, look at that. She wasn't treated well by her husband, and she got divorced, and she never remarried, and she kind of looked like a man. Was she gay? Was she transgendered? Was she a cross-dresser? And so we're off to the races. First of all, she never claimed to be anything but a woman, so she's not trans anything, okay? She dressed the way she dressed not because she felt that, you know, she wanted to appear as a man, but because she felt women's clothing of that era, and I'm not an expert on women's clothing of any era, but I do know back then there was a lot of layers and all kinds of stuff going on, and she felt it was unhealthy, and so she didn't want to dress that way for health reasons and probably comfort reasons as well. Okay, so that's fine. So then what we're dealing with here is a woman who was single for a long time. And if you really want to get me worked up about something, and I don't get like worked up about a whole lot of things that easily, but to tell somebody who is a long-term single person that they're gay just because they're a long-term single person is an insult to that person. And in this case, it's an insult to the era that Mary Walker came from. She, of course, cannot defend herself. So it's easy for us now to dump this on her. But the truth of the matter is there is not one scintilla of evidence, zero, zilch, nada, evidence at all that she was anything but a straight woman who was married and got divorced. It was in a bad marriage, which certainly was nothing unusual there. And then she went on to live the rest of her life according to her beliefs. And as a Christian woman, of course, homosexuality wouldn't have been consistent with those beliefs. So if you're going to say this about her or any person from the past who is no longer here to defend themselves, who lived in an entirely different era, whose issues were not the issues we're dealing with today. I'm recording this in 2025, by the way, November of 2025. Then you'd better have some evidence. I want to see the evidence. What evidence do you have? Well, she never got remarried. Lots of people have not gotten remarried who are not homosexual. All right? Let's be real here. Just because you choose to be single is not evidence of anything. It doesn't prove anything either way, okay? It's just choices people make, and they have their own personal reasons, whatever they may be. But to force modern day issues on them and use them, lift them up as some great example of, no, that's totally wrong. And it's an insult to her, and it's an insult to all of us who have been single for a long time. And we need to stop this nonsense. This is about history, okay? The two little short form podcasts I do, The Ultimate Sacrifice, this one, and Tales from the Script, which is telling Bible stories and looking at the evidence for that and the archaeological finds and all that stuff. That's all history. And if you're going to try to do history, you have to let the facts of history lead you where they may, okay? Not your inclinations, not your desires, not things that you'd like to see or think you should be seeing. You got to have facts. Otherwise, you can't make those kinds of statements and really be an objective, trustworthy source. So can we just please stop doing that, okay? Let's just stop it. It's wrong. It is an insult to those people, and it's an insult to the intelligence of your viewers or your listeners, because if you don't have any evidence, don't expect me to believe whatever you have to say. If you want to say, I think that maybe blah, 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 well, at least, you're making it your own personal opinion, but really, your personal opinion doesn't belong in these things. My personal opinion doesn't belong here unless I'm really clear about it. And I try to keep my personal opinions out of this because that's not what this is about. This is a story about Mary Walker and what she did with her life, not me. Okay? It's not about me. It's about the subjects of these podcasts. So I just wanted to lay that out. Let's put that to rest. Let's stop this nonsense, please. Please. And with that, I'm gone.